We'll just give a minute as people are joining. I can see the numbers going up, 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 which is wonderful. The numbers are not stabilizing yet, Michael. This means people are very happy to be here listening. They're still going up. Okay. So I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is a very special event for the University of Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas. I'm sorry that I have to keep a mask on and be joining you only for a little while. I'm caring for a loved one in the hospital, but I wanted to make sure that I could at least be with you to introduce and say how important it is to us to have Professor Bustamante today joining us. This is one of our final webinars of this academic year, and it's pretty incredible to be able to close out with this particular one. We're so pleased to host Professor Michael Bustamante, the Emilio Bacardi Moro Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences, who has now just completed just about a full year at the University of Miami, bringing all sorts of novelty and fresh perspective to all that we do on Cuban and Cuban American studies. And we are thrilled as an institute and thrilled as a university that you're with us. We've had several opportunities to be able to talk about the future of research and the way to apply this sort of fresh perspective on how we can learn from the past, move forward in the future, apply this to lessons and key issues in our entire region and in fact globally. And the fact that our university can now do that through and with you is a blessing for everyone. I'm also incredibly pleased to be able to turn this over to Professor Lillian Mansler, who is helping to lead all of our work at the Institute on Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and has collaborated with us for many years, of which we're very grateful, but now has truly a leadership role within our institute. She has been a force in ensuring that Professor Bustamante is with us and in making sure that we can do this event today. She is our faculty director for Latin American Caribbean research. And I want to thank all of the staff who have made it possible. And as you can hear, there's now quite a bit of noise in the hospital in the background. So I was lucky to get those 5 minutes. Please don't assume that because I have to leave, it isn't because we are not interested, quite the opposite. And I'll look forward to listening to the video a little bit later this afternoon or this evening. Lillian, let me turn it now over to you, please.
Thank you, Felicia, for those kinds of words, and welcome everyone. Now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Bustamante. As Dr. Knoll said, Dr. Bustamante is Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Moro Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami, where he teaches courses on Cuban, modern US, Latin American, and Latina history. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Miami, he served as Assistant Professor of Latin American History at Florida International University. He's the author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile, which was published in 2021 by the University of North Carolina Press. In this book, Dr. Bustamante analyzes how Cubans from both sides of the Florida Straits negotiated their past during the first 20 years of the Cuban Revolution. He presents a multifaceted account of the revolution story that goes against the oftentimes black and white versions we receive. He's also co-editor with Jennifer Lamb of The Revolution from Within, Cuba 1959 through 1980, published in 2019 by Duke University Press. In this volume, the contributors explore the dynamics of sociopolitical inclusion and exclusion during the revolution's first 2 decades, drawing on previously unexamined archives. Prior to pursuing academic work, Dr. Bustamante served as Research Associate of Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. His commentary on contemporary Cuban and Cuban American affairs has appeared and continued to appear in publications like Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, and also has been featured in media outlets like NPR, the BBC, the New York Times, etc. I've had the pleasure to collaborate with Dr. Bustamante on several projects. Fall 2020, we developed and taught a course on the Mariel boat lift, and we also co-edited a special issue of Anthurium, a Caribbean Studies journal on the topic of El Mariel. The title of the presentation today is Reflections on the Politics of Cuba's Past and Cuban Pasts Not Told. Mike, welcome, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Lillian, for the overly generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I also want to thank Felicia for joining us, Michael Graybeal, Jeffrey Farmer, and everyone at UMIA for the very kind invitation. I am, as Felicia said, sort of coming up to a full year or full academic year at least since I joined the faculty, and yet I still find myself needing to meet many people. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share a bit about myself and my work, particularly with the UMIA community. So the talk that I've planned for today draws on my recent book, Cuban Memory Wars, that Lillian just generously described. And in fact, what I want to kind of do today is introduce you to the subject matter of the book, but also in a fairly informal way, sort of take you under the hood, so to speak, of some of its contents, showing you some of the materials I consulted for the research, and talking through some of the ways I set about interpreting them and the challenges I faced in doing so, or at least some of those challenges. But first, I thought I would sort of set the stage by reading to you some of the opening lines of the book. And before I do that, I need to do the ritual sharing of the screen, which I neglected to do a second ago. So bear with me. Hopefully you all can see that. So let me set the stage by reading the opening couple paragraphs of the book. There are two widely familiar versions of the Cuban story. According to the first, on January 1st, 1959, a ragtag band of rebels swept down from the Sierra Maestra, delivering Cuba from the clutches of short-term dictatorship and longer neo-colonial submission to the United States. In this view, the quote-unquote triumph of the Cuban Revolution marked the definitive end of one period of the island's history, nearly 6 decades of pseudo-republican scandal following the island's mortgaged independence in 1902, and the beginning of true liberty under the banner of revolutionary change. The second version of the saga accepts its rival's chronological pivot point, but it inverts the order of praise. In the alternate tale, the Cuban Revolution represented not a fulfillment of nationalist dreams, but an unmitigated tragedy. For many of those who left the island in the 1960s, Cuba's turn to socialism made the pre-revolutionary period look like paradise lost, transforming their homeland into an island in chains. And in Havana, Miami, and the many coordinates of Cuba's far-flung diaspora around the globe, these dueling master narratives are still routinely on display. More than 60 years after Fidel Castro's rise to power, and more than 4 since his death, diametrically opposed accounts of Cuba's past continue to square off in competing public spaces, museums, and now even social media campaigns. But dig beneath either iteration of the tale, and less streamlined or comfortable narratives of Cuba's history begin to emerge. In reality, Cubans' arguments about their past and the ways they have related to it since 1959 have never been so straightforward or stable. It may be tempting to reduce Cubans' battles over their history to a metaphorical standoff between one set of voices shouting from Revolution Square in Havana and another positioned atop Miami's literal and figurative Freedom Tower. But if popular visions of the Cuban Revolution's legacies today seem polarized, that polarization conceals more nuanced viewpoints, and it is the result of political processes that were and continue to be anything but neat. So begins the book, setting the stage, I hope, for all that follows. And in 200 some pages and 6 chapters, Cuban Memory Wars endeavors to tell the history, or perhaps I should say a history or part of the history of Cubans' mobilizations of, reckonings with, and debates over their past during the Cuban Revolution's crucial first 20 years in power. I've long been fascinated by the prominent place that competing understandings of the island's history occupy in Cuban political cultures. But I was also convinced that there was a need to elucidate the longer and frankly more complicated trajectory of such disagreements. That, in essence, is what I hope this book achieves, revealing that Cubans' competing selective remembrances, to borrow a phrase from the historian Steve Stern, have neither been static nor strictly cyclical over time. Put simply, I argue in the book that prominent struggles over history and memory within, between, and beyond the cities of Havana and Miami didn't just fuel enduring contests over what it meant to be Cuban, but also were central to the course of Cuban history itself. Indeed, one only has to look to the first months following Fidel Castro's rise to power to see how history and memory emerged as prominent battlegrounds and languages on and through which revolutionary officials, cultural producers, and diverse political actors and citizens endeavor to invest their fellow citizens in specific understandings of the revolution's origins and purpose as a national quest. Disagreements, however, over precisely how and why the revolution came to be, which factions should shape its future, and ultimately whether its promises were fulfilled, sparked competitions for historical prerogative that really never went away and with which Cubans have been dealing ever since. So drawing upon rare press, organizational and personal correspondence, visual media, and to a lesser extent, oral history, I tracked such tensions as they developed in Cuba and trailed those Cubans decamping to the United States across the 1960s and beyond. As Cubans on the island navigated the promises and perils of a socialist regime, and as those who became disenchanted with the revolutionary government fled into exile, they regularly reflected upon what had happened, why, and how to further propel or for some reverse history's course. Now, my book is certainly not the first to note the salience of the past to Cuba's political presence. Lilian Guerra, one of my mentors, has excavated, quote, how the grand narrative of the emergent Cuban revolutionary state gave mass participation in the revolutionary process meaning, end quote, in the 1960s. And her work has been foundational to my understanding of these issues. Nor am I the first to think about the histories of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban exile community relationally. Nena Torres did just that in her influential book, In the Land of Mirrors, more than 20 years ago, and yet it remains somewhat of an exception, I think, in Cuban studies for its integration under a single focus of what's happening on the island and what's happening in the diaspora. But I'd like to think that my book builds on this previous scholarship by offering a more textured, culturally inflected, and fine-grained exploration of the politics of the past in an evolving Cuban present in real time. And it does so not by focusing so much on representations of history strictly in monuments, museums, or public spaces, although those venues are part of the inquiry here, but more on the mundane stages, public and private, where divergent appreciations of and anxieties about the Cuban past were routinely on display. So the speeches of political leaders, dueling editorials in the revolutionary or exile press, organizational records, correspondence, and cultural texts like television, cartoons, art, song, and film. By bringing to bear such a diversity of materials, I hope readers will appreciate the breadth of the actors involved, as well as the multiple ways the specter of the Cuban past as inspiration, trauma, keenly felt epic, or at a certain point, repetitive official script pervaded so many aspects of post-1959 Cuban and Cuban diasporic life. Now, as a historian of memory or retrospective politics, as I call it in the title of the book, my goal in writing this study was fundamentally to track competing claims about the memory and history of the Cuban nation among diverse Cuban actors over time. But it is difficult, of course, to be a historian of memory or the ways that we as groups, cultures, and societies relate to our past without in some way intervening in the very field of memory politics that we seek to study. After all, any historian who strives to write histories that aren't memorable in some way probably shouldn't be in the business. In many ways, historians then are also purveyors and participants in a given society's memory wars. I think that is particularly true in a case like Cuba's, where a strong one-party state invested and continues to invest so much time and effort into constructing, maintaining, and policing the foundational myth of its emergence and subsequent longevity, and which, in fact, hired, in a sense, in terms of how a public education system worked, historians at its public funded universities, journals, and magazines, right? I think of the famous essay by the historian, Cuban historian Manuel Moreno Farginals, where he described history como arma, as an arm, right? Which is not to say all historians working in revolutionary Cuba were simply propagandists, but it is to say that their work often did have a kind of symbiotic relationship to the broader critique of prior ways of understanding Cuban history that the revolutionary government itself was advancing. On the other hand, in a more oppositional sense, the work of the historian of memory, or of any other topic, can often be seen as exposing the fallacies of official history, of filling in the memory of the nation that the state has otherwise sought to sequester, contain, or erase. And I would hasten to mention here the recent publication of a book by my colleague Abel Sierra Madero, that in reconstructing the history of a traumatic episode like the UMAP forced labor camps in the 1960s, is not only telling the history of that episode, but in a sense, reconstructing memory that has otherwise been lost under the official history of the Cuban state. So my book too counters the official history of the revolution as told by the Cuban state, but it does so in a slightly different, though I would insist, complementary way. That is, in deconstructing the evolution of Cuba's official history itself, and in historicizing the course of Cubans' debates over and reckonings with their past across the revolution's first 2 decades, I found myself often recovering significant junctures, processes, textures, and statements from Cuban history, or more often from the memory wars themselves, that were erased from official, quasi-official, or otherwise canonical iterations of Cuban historical memory subsequently. Likewise, I am equally attentive to the complexities, silences, and elisions in narratives of Cuban history told from the island's diaspora community, as even counter-official histories and narratives carry often silences of their own. Exile in my study is not just the terrain where true memory lies, preserved and rescued from the censorship of the communist state. It is equally a ground of contestation, narrative construction, and yes, sometimes even manipulation, albeit absent the centralizing power and influence of a state of its own. In the end, all acts of memory involve acts of forgetting and are thus partial, calling out to be critically assessed and deconstructed rather than taken at face value as products of total recall. There is no such thing. So that is what I mean then by the politics of Cuba's past and Cuban pasts not told in the title of my talk today. The pasts not told in my work are the pasts of argument, selective remembrance, and strategic silences in representations of the Cuban past itself. Put another way, this book intervenes in the Cuban memory wars by offering its own alternate narrative of Cuban history, one in which Cubans' battles over the past since 1959, not just their diversion experiences of it, become part of historical memory themselves, or at least I think they should be. Now, to begin telling this story, I had to confront a paradox. Namely, why would history matter so much if the Cuban Revolution, as a project devoted to bringing about a utopian future, was so invested in leaving the past behind? The answer goes beyond the power of short-term contrast. On the one hand, the image of a shameful before under the rule of Fulgencio Batista did reinforce the premise and promise of a revolutionary after. But on the other hand, the victory of diverse revolutionary forces in 1959 also channeled longer-held nationalist dreams. There's an essay I often turn to by Damian Fernandez, in which he characterizes Cuban history as moving through repeated cycles of desire and disenchantment. Now, that idea may seem too conveniently alliterative or even a tad reductionist, but he helps us understand the ways Cuba's history, prior to 1959 at least, did seem to be full of so many both foundational and serial what-if moments. What if the United States had not intervened in 1898, converting Cuba's war for independence into the Spanish-American War? What if Jose Marti hadn't died before that? What if the quote-unquote revolution of 1930s, 1933 that threw out Gerardo Machado had proved more lasting? What if the democratic spring in Cuba of the 1940s wasn't marred by corruption? And on and on. What if Fulgencio Batista had not staged a coup d'etat in 1952 in the first place, therefore creating at least the most proximate cause of the revolution that followed? The point is, by the 1950s, there was a pretty wide strain in Cuban political culture that saw the island's history and destiny as being unfulfilled. And this new revolution taking shape as the chance to end the cycle of serial disappointment once and for all. The problem was that the triumph of the revolution was quickly followed by pitched debates about and competing understandings of what caused it and what it, the revolution that is, was even about. Debates also revolved around how to commemorate heroes of and award credit for victory in the anti-Batista fight. A very complicated set of memory battles in their own right, given the number of factions involved. So what I found when I dove into the sources was a heretofore under-historicized picture of overwhelming memory consensus on the one hand, a sense that so much in the nation's past had brought Cubans to this moment of singular promise, accompanied by incredibly complex wars of position over who had the historical bona fides and credentials to speak authoritatively in the revolution's name. It is these debates about the immediate pre-revolutionary past that remain insufficiently known or remembered under the weight of a more streamlined narrative that the Cuban government would establish as official history later. And I thought I would just show a few examples of these kinds of sources. The sources that on the one hand, I think show incredible degree of kind of consensus of thinking about the triumph of the revolution as a moment of historical no return, and yet the sources that are showing very quickly battles over historical legacies that immediately preceded it, right? Battles over the right to speak in the revolution's name based on what one had done in its service or before it came to power. So in the former category, I would highlight, texts like this. This might not be an unfamiliar source to some of you. This is a kind of comic book of early revolutionary history, so to speak, from mid-1959, which depicts the history of the revolution as a more or less unitary story of heroism and morality fighting against immorality. I would also highlight this cover image, right? And this, I think, gives you a sense of also my engagement with popular culture in the book. This cover cartoon from the satirical magazine Zigzag from early 1959, this sense that ahora sí, now finally, right? But we as the Cuban people are going to achieve what we've long set out to achieve. There's much that's invested in this cartoon that's not just about having overthrown the government that preceded Fidel Castro's rise to power. This kind of sense of unified historic promise based on a certain kind of shared memory of national disappointment prior to that point is also reflected in things like film. Film made even before the Cuban revolutionary government establishes a state-run film industry as it would later be known and famous for, right? But this film is actually the first film made in Cuba after 1959. It's made by actually a group of filmmakers who had previously worked for a subsidiary of a US film company, RKO of Cuba. And it's kind of a very campy, cheesy, actually quite awful romance in which sort of the culmination of their love coincides with the triumph of the revolution, right? So the historical stakes here and personal stakes here are married. And a last example of the kind of unified historical promise that I'm talking about and the way that this connected with deeper legacies and historical issues and allegories going back far before the period of Fulgencio Batista in the 1950s. This is an ad in the press, the Cuban revolutionary press from 1960, at a time when the Cuban government is moving quite aggressively to convert military barracks associated with the former government into schools, right? And sort of symbolize kind of the new promise, ostensibly, of what the new government is bringing about. What's fascinating here is that they elect to open this new school on the 28th of January, which is the birthday of Jose Marti. And so there's also a famous Jose Marti poem where the first lines are "En julio como en enero," in July as in January. And it just so happens that the name of Fidel Castro's political movement is the 26th of July movement, right? And so this is this kind of sense or claim that what the new government represents is a kind of a communion between a past of in some sense frustrated struggle for true Cuban independence, and now this new movement coming to power, the 26th of July movement principally, that's going to really achieve those dreams. The other thing, though, that I found in this early period, though, was these wars for position right away. The sense that of the diverse kinds of factions in the early revolutionary government's fold, there were very intense arguments over who did what, when, why, for what purpose in service of the revolution. And thus, as I said, who had the right to kind of speak in its name most authoritatively, or who had the right to, in a sense, represent its history. So this is another early cartoon from that same publication, Zigzag Libre, that I love, also from very early, January 31st, 1959. And it's a satire, in a sense, of the way in which, in the wake of the revolution, at least according to the critical perspective of this cartoonist, many folks were kind of coming out of the woodworks to invent revolutionary histories for themselves, right? So this is kind of critique of historical fakes and revolutionary pretenders. So this cartoon is called Waiting Room at a Ministry, a new ministry of the new revolutionary government. You have all these folks walking around who are decidedly middle-aged looking folks in suits, but who are quickly buying up little emblems of revolutionary affiliation of one kind of group or another. There's one guy walking around wondering where his beard has gone. You know, I used to have, my beard was just here, right? Where has it gone? So this sense that everybody is kind of coming out of the works after 1959, after the quote unquote triumph, to say, yes, we too were part of it, and therefore we can stake a claim on it, right? I think there's a more sort of politically substantive substrate, though, to this cartoon, and it has to do with the fact that when the revolution comes to power, yes, Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement is, in a sense, king politically, but it's not the only game in town. And very quickly, there are very pitched, intense arguments between different factions, namely the 26th of July movement, remnants of a student organization called the Directorio, and Cuba's historic Communist Party, the PSP, to sort of all claim that they had done the most, or at least sufficiently enough, in service of the revolution or bringing it to power, so that they could, stake a claim on leadership or certainly participation in the government that was to follow, right? So this is an example of a kind of feature that you would find throughout the newspapers that represented each of the different revolutionary organizations that are kind of jockeying for power. This is from the newspaper of the historic Cuban Communist Party, known as the PSP, where they would have these kind of recurring features telling the stories of their quote unquote martyrs of the struggle against Batista. And this is particularly significant in the case of the Cuban Communist Party, because the degree of their participation and support for the revolution all along was deeply questioned, including by very important members of Fidel Castro's own movement. Given the fact that when Fidel Castro first launched his attempt to start a revolution against Fulgencio Batista in 1953, the Communist Party of Cuba, which was underground at the time, called that Fidel Castro's first attempt, the attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, a bourgeois putsch. So these are kind of memories that these different political forces don't easily forget. And so you see in the press kind of different folks jockeying for position, particularly about the role of the historic Communist Party in Cuba's history and whether it's going to have a place in the revolution to become. And so ironically, you see people warning quite intently about the risks of falling into factionalism, as you see here. And yet that's exactly what happens, right, in so many different corners, right? So on the one hand, a kind of a liberal reformist like Andres Valdespino in the pages of Bohemia magazine, which is sort of like Cuba's Newsweek at the time, basically supporting radical social reforms as part of what the revolution is meant to achieve, but denying that communism as an ideology or the Communist Party of Cuba should have anything to do with bringing it about. And here you have a Cuban Communist Party ideologue and political leader, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, basically saying, if we've gotten this far to achieving progressive goals, whatever the sort of the history of the Cuban Communist Party involvement or not in the revolution at different phases, we are part of that story. And thus we also have a claim on what this revolution is going to become. And I end the first chapter, though, by highlighting the ways in which, as time progresses, as we move past 1959 into 1960, and particularly 61, as the US-Cuba relationship really begins to disintegrate, it is that story and the historic kind of substrate of that relationship that really takes center stage in terms of the revolution's own sense of its historic identity, right? So the revolution's memory narrative or historical narrative becomes more and more one of an anti-imperialist political project, where these sort of internal battles that had been so prominent in the pages of the press in 1959 and 1960 begin to play a little bit second fiddle. So moving to in a sense, the second chapter of the book, and I'm not going to go through every single chapter, I'm just highlighting 3 in total. But the omnipresence of the past in the case of the Cuban exile community, I think, is perhaps easier to understand than in the case of a revolutionary project that is so ostensibly forward-looking. And that's because those who found themselves in disagreement with the direction that the revolution ended up taking and felt pressured directly and indirectly to flee the country naturally felt a need to articulate some shared understanding of the experiences of uprooting that they had endured and where the revolution had gone wrong. Right. So the political identity of the early Cuban exile community, especially here in Miami, did find an anchor in common experiences and memories of displacement, property and business confiscations, and worse, state violence, and of course, nostalgia for a country left behind. The difficulty, though, was that Cuban exiles after 1959 also brought, in fact, complex political legacies with them to the United States in their own right. And while they shared much in common, most obviously an enmity toward the Castro government or what it had become, they also found reason to fiercely debate among themselves, to debate who among them may have been more complicit in the nation's predicament and what had led to Fidel Castro's path to victory in the first place. And this was all complicated by the fact that so many had been supporters of this vague thing called the revolution initially. So longing for a lost Cuba provided, I think, only a partial source of cultural and political unity for the early exile community, certainly. And this is not, interestingly, the story that I think the exile community typically tells about itself. Right? Today, the most common narrative of the Cuban exile experience, of my own family's experience, is one of shared sacrifice, hard work, having to leave everything behind, and uplift. And there's certainly a great deal of truth in that. But I think what I found was that when I dove into the archives of the early Cuban exile community, I found that those narratives that I think we now take for granted about what the history is of the exile community, that those were not yet constructed as sort of common narratives. And in fact, exiles in the early 1960s were deeply involved in arguments with one another to try to figure out what had just happened to them, right? I mean, it's a sort of a natural thing that one might expect, but I think it's kind of been overlooked and forgotten. And much of the work that I did for this chapter was actually here at the University of Miami at the Cuban Heritage Collection, where when I dove into the records, dove into not just the Cuban exile press in the 1960s, but the records of various Cuban exile early political organizations, anti-Castro organizations, you find these kind of complex wars or battles over historical position everywhere you look. One sort of particular individual that I focus on in this chapter as a way into this subject is the political leader Jose Miro Cardona, who has a particularly interesting history. He was a well-known lawyer and jurist, in Havana. He'd actually served as the first prime minister of the revolutionary government for a couple of months before Fidel Castro takes this position. But he eventually becomes a leader of the Cuban exile community. He is disenchanted with the revolution's move to the left across 1960 and 61. He ends up in Miami and he ends up leading two organizations, the FRD and then the Cuban Revolutionary Council, that are really important in the early history of the Cuban exile community because they ostensibly are the political front that is leading the effort ostensibly toward what eventually becomes the Bay of Pigs invasion. Right. But it's very interesting when you think about kind of his own narrative, because Jose Miro Cardona finds himself in a Miami where there are people not only who have different political trajectories than his own. He arrives in a Miami in 1960-61, where some of the first people to have arrived before him, understandably, are those who had been associated or allied with the government that the revolution has just overthrown and that Miro Cardona himself had opposed, right, as part of a broader revolutionary front in the 1950s. And so Miro Cardona's kind of narrative, which becomes very much also the narrative of the US government in this period, is that the history of the revolution to this point needs to be understood as the history of a revolution betrayed, a revolution that was necessary, but had somewhere gone off course, right? Right away, he is met with stinging critique on the part of those in Miami already who are arguing, no, you're wrong, that there was never any need for a revolution, and sort of portraying the 1950s as sort of the high point of Cuba's economic and political achievement, notwithstanding the fact that there was an undemocratic government in power, let alone what one could say about social conditions at the time, urban, rural inequalities, and other social issues that were on the mouths of many, even moderate revolutionary leaders like him. And so you go into his papers and you find him reflecting in correspondence or people writing to him about the challenge of uniting the exile community around not just a common sense of enmity toward Fidel Castro, but a sense of a common historical narrative, and referencing how difficult this is, given all of the fraught historical legacies that are at play in the exile community itself. So this is from a letter that's written to Miro Cardona at some point in 1961, just after the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, incidentally. So I think that speaks a little bit to the mood here. But this interlocutor for Miro Cardona writes, I hope that you are able to unify all Cubans in exile, but this unification must revolve around the future. We cannot continue thinking about the ominous past, which in reality was ominous not only in the lapse of time up until December 31st, 1958, but also up until yesterday, because yesterday is also past and it is also ominous. And then here he comes in with this mixed metaphor that I love. In this Frankenstein, Dr. Miro, that is the Frankenstein of the exile community, the sort of composite of groups and factions, we've all got a bit of Dracula in us, which is my best rendition of the Spanish original. En este Frankenstein, todos tenemos de Drácula, which I think sounds better than in the English. I repeat, Dr. Miro, I think we should move toward unity, not as former Batista supporters with or against Batista, supporters of Prio, a former Cuban president, or as supporters of Fidel without Fidel, but rather as a total unity of Cubans. And if we are incapable of giving up our own egoisms and personal ambitions, then we have to conclude that we overwhelmingly deserve what we are suffering. This, I think, was one of the more powerful manifestations of kind of the early memory wars inside the Cuban exile community in the early 1960s. And I'll highlight too some of the kind of visual manifestations of these tensions, right? On the one hand, you do get representations like this, and this is Zigzag Libre. So this is the version of that newspaper that I already referenced from the island after it was closed, or after its creators felt forced into exile themselves for criticizing the Cuban revolutionary government. In here, this cover, which is admittedly from a number of years later, you see a rather kind of straightforward, simplistic, nostalgic evocation of the Cuba of yesteryear, right, as a place of happiness, right, sort of the lost paradise idea. And yet what's interesting is that this same publication was also the venue a few years before for a cartoon like this, which is a manifestation of more than idea, Miro Cardona's idea, the idea that the revolution was necessary, and that even in 1959, as you see here on the left, this is with the revolution in power, was still a good thing. And that only subsequently, as you see on the right, had the revolution gone off course and become a communist dictatorship that no one ever wanted or predicted, right? And it raises the question, if one believed that the revolution was necessary, or some kind of revolution was necessary, right? Could the Cuba of before the revolution have truly been a paradise lost, right? That is, I think, actually a tension that's at the heart of sort of memory politics and memory culture in the early exile community that I see popping up in lots of different ways. And maybe one final example from the exile scene, which I love, also from Zigzag Libre, is a kind of a poem that's a generous use of the term, called The Encounter at the Doors of the Refugee Center. And essentially, this is a kind of an example of the internal blame game kind of conversation part of the Cuban exile memory wars that one can come across. And so the plot, if you will, of this poem is one in which a guy who ostensibly had opposed the revolution from the start and seen the bad things coming, suddenly is surprised to find at the entrance to the Cuban Refugee Center at Freedom Tower here in Miami, someone that he remembers back from Cuba, who he remembers having been just the most kind of blind supporter of the revolution all along. And so, the irony or the hypocrisy, allegedly, of someone who had supported the revolution to then show up in Miami asking for support from the U.S. government. And so the kind of the question of complicity here, I think, among exiles themselves in this shared trauma is what comes up for me. So debates about the revolution's original purpose and results did not end, of course, in the 1960s. In the case of the exile community, despite the hardening attraction of a shared, less critical nostalgia for a lost Cuba, nor even did they completely go away on the island. And while it's true that the consolidation of a socialist one-party state hardened also the purview of official history on the island and reduced spaces for debate and contestation in a now plainly state-run media, one can still trace fascinating and revealing evolutions in the form of that official history over time, as well as the ways Cuban artists and individuals attempted to complicate it. So these then are some of the subsequent stories and historical processes that I endeavor to trace in the remainder of the book, whether by examining the ways Cuban artists and writers used the otherwise sacrosanct, triumphalist memory of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, that is from a revolutionary perspective, to look back on the history of the revolution with more wary, dare I say, more skeptical eyes. And the example I would highlight here is the famous Cuban film Memories of Underdevelopment from 1968, which is set in the months between the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and gives a very kind of the many things that one could say about this film, this is a film that gives a very uneasy take on the history of the revolution that Cubans have lived, right, rather than simply celebrating it. And that, I think, is an interesting move to find on the part of a filmmaker who's working, after all, under the auspices of a state-run film industry by this point. Or whether it's the way in which chapter 4 of the book looks at the emergence in exile of youth cohorts in the late 60s and 70s, increasingly willing to question some of the historical knowledge and memories about Cuba that they had inherited from their parents. Likewise, on the island, I trace how in the 1970s, amid a culture of memory surplus and anniversary overload, as I call it, I'm representing that here in perhaps Cuba's most famous action drama on Cuban television in the late 1970s. And also amid a culture of memories, and at the same time that the revolution's official history was becoming more streamlined than ever, you still find ways in which pressing questions about whether younger Cubans had anything memorable left to fight for sometimes pop up in state media culture itself. And I would highlight here the example of a pretty little known film, One Day in November by Humberto Solas, in which the main character, a health crisis prompts him to sort of reflect in complicated ways on the trajectory of revolutionary participation and identification that he has lived. But I want to end today's talk by reflecting a bit on a final example of the kinds of materials I deal with in the book, drawn from the last chapter of the book, which is the only one to draw significantly on oral history. And that may seem odd for a book with the theme of memory at its core. And so I want to say something as to why. But let me set the stage for this last chapter. In the 1970s, as I was just trying to suggest, the dominant memory narrative and official history of the Cuban revolutionary state in some ways reached its zenith of power and influence. But it was also about to be disrupted, in part as a result of ginger contacts that had begun in those years or been reinitiated between limited portions of the Cuban exiled world and the revolutionary state. 1979, however, marked the moment of, I think, greatest challenge to the revolution's official memory canon to that point. And particularly the portion of its memory canon that was based on sort of denigrating the memory of those who had left, right? Denigrating the memory of those who had left as, in fact, symbols of that past Cuba that the revolution was supposed to leave behind. And that's because in 1979, for the first time since they had left, with few exceptions, Cuban exiles were allowed to go back to the island to visit, and 100,000 did so in the span of a year. And so the result, I was convinced of this process of these visits must have been an important memory encounter, as those who returned shared stories that demystified histories of exile and heard stories from family and friends that inversely demystified the history of the revolution itself. But ironically, when I went to the Cuban state press or even the exile press, I found that an experience that certainly must have been quite memorable for those who participated in it had left very little written record. It was as if this important turning point in the Cuban memory wars itself had been written out of history and memory entirely. So to this point in the book, oral history had not really been the focus or a major technique of the work. I was interested, to be sure, in how individual Cubans did or did not internalize the terms of the revolutionary state's evolving official story or exile versions built to counter it. But I was convinced that getting at that subjectivity would be difficult through oral histories conducted in the present that would inevitably reflect the imprint of memory wars since. And so in the case of the visits of 1979, however, I had no choice but to conduct interviews, though I used them not as the fundamental topic of analysis, but rather as windows into the kinds of experiences that marked those fraud exchanges between those who stayed and those who had left in the historical moment I was interested in 1979. And I think the results were really revealing. I mean, of the interviews that I conducted, it just became clear how profound and challenging and how fraught of a memory encounter these visits were for family members who hadn't seen one another in 10, 15, 20 years. Families in some cases that had been more divided across political lines or less divided across political lines, but all of whom had struggled to stay in touch because of the complexities of doing so, given the rupture of US-Cuban relations and the rest of it, right? And this was a process of visits that was accompanied by a certain amount of controversy that on the one hand, the Cuban government's objective here was simply to make money off of the new exiled travelers, but there's also a sub-story of exiles traveling into Cuba itself with kind of conspicuous displays of their success as immigrants, and the way that that, in a sense, brings the veil down ostensibly on how Cubans on the island had been taught to think about their own history and the history of the United States or the history of the exile community itself. To such a degree that the Cuban government actually has to change its customs regulations in the middle of this process to try to sort of stem the flow of goods that are coming into the country, because they see them in a sense not just as a material threat, but also a kind of an ideological or a memory threat. And I'll leave this portion of the talk just with this thought, right? One interviewee that I spoke to about this experience described the process of re-encountering family members that had left to exile as almost as if they were attending a wake in reverse, un velorio al revés. And for me, that's just incredibly eloquent and powerful phrase that I think speaks to the personal histories and memories that are at stake in these visits, and the way that they take Cubans outside of sort of the meta narratives of either the Cuban Revolutionary State or the exile community as such. So I think just in the interest of time, I will end there. I'll just say quickly that this is not a book that purports that the Cuban memory wars end in 1979. I can say something more about why I chose to end that book, end at least the most substantive portion of the book in 1979. It is a book that includes a kind of a lengthy conclusion that attempts to sort of synoptically cover some of the subsequent history of the Cuban memory wars from 1979 onward. But this is also a book that in its quest to both reconstruct the history and memory of the Cuban memory wars is also keenly aware that it was going to be impossible to cover it all. And so the thing that I perhaps hope for the most is that if there are gaps in what this book covers or the pieces of the Cuban memory wars that it covers, nothing would make me happier than to have other folks try to come and fill in those gaps, because this is a bigger story than I was able to cover in just 200 something pages. So I'll leave it there, and I'm grateful again for your interest and attention today, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this excellent presentation. And to everyone listening, I'm sorry I forgot to mention at the beginning that you can actually pose questions, and we invite you to pose questions to Mike. You have a button at your bottom right that says Q&A. So please feel free to type in your questions, and I will, read them to Mike as they come. So please go ahead. And apologies for not having said that at the beginning. So maybe as we wait for questions to come in, Michael, I can start. So when you were talking about those junctures that were erased or silenced, right, at different moments of the 60s and the 70s, you talked about how in exile, like the 1950s became a point of contestation, like the history, right, and the involvement in the revolution. You talked about strategic forgetting. I was wondering if you could give us an example in your book about like exile's strategic forgetting. So how you deal with that, and just talk about one example of strategic forgetting.
Well, I think the phrase strategic forgetting merits first some definition, right? Because I think there's a forms. I think there's times when you see evidence of that, and it's deliberate, right? There's an intentionality behind it, and that in that sense, the adjective strategic makes, I think, quite literal sense. But I think there's another kind of strategic forgetting that isn't necessarily deliberate, that may be a product of the evolution of one's thought, but is also, one can see, sort of responding to political dynamics that do serve strategic purposes, right? Particularly vis-a-vis this goal of trying to establish a kind of a unified memory fabric for the exile community out of what was decidedly not united one, certainly in many respects. And I think the biggest example for me, and I go back to the case of Jose Miro Cardona. I mean, he's somebody who, in exile early on, is very insistent that a revolution was necessary. B, the goal of the revolution wasn't just either to sort of rewind the clock before Batista's coup, right? There's a critique too of the era of Cuba's quote unquote democratic spring in the 40s and into the early 50s is one that was marred by disappointment and corruption and things like that, right? And he says all of this quite insistently, and he's writing letters, publicly and privately, insisting on this, right? I mean, he still sounds like a revolutionary in that kind of, what would seem like a more moderate version compared to the radical process on the island. But in the wake of the Bay of Pigs invasion, you start to see, particularly in his private correspondence, his thinking evolve. And part of that is born out of actually a personal relationship that he strikes up with a man named Rafael Guasinclan, who had been sort of Batista's chosen successor in elections that were held in the late 1950s, marred by accusations of not being real or legitimate. But nonetheless, Rafael Guasinclan is sort of a Batista ally, right? And it's very interesting to see them correspond, and they both begin to correspond. They were really political enemies, right? But they begin to correspond because both of their children had gone off to fight in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And they begin to correspond when both of their children are in Cuban prisons between 61 and the end of 62. And that begins what seems to me is a kind of a journey for Miro Cardona toward trying to articulate a more uniform position. And so first you then see him argue things like, well, at the end of the day, we're not going to judge anyone based on their prior political affiliations. As long as everyone who wants to come together for the future of Cuba will embrace them. But I think it reaches its zenith where, whereas in 1961 he's arguing quite clearly that social reform is an intrinsic part of this betrayed revolution that he still believes in. By 1964, I found a speech that he gives in Puerto Rico where he argues that a social revolution and deep social change was not necessary at all. So is that deliberate on his part? Is it strategic in that sense? I'm not sure. But does it achieve certain strategic ends in terms of kind of blunting some of the discord in the memory fabric of the exile community? I think so. And so that's an example of that kind of strategic forgetting as I saw it play out in the exile context.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Joan Moreno, who's a PhD student in the Department of Modern Languages. And he says, this is like bringing us way forward. What do you think is the status of the memory wars as they pertain to 11J, to 11 July?
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, there's I guess a few different ways that one could approach that. One is the memory war as to what happened on 11J. This is referring to the historic protests in Cuba last summer and the different versions that are being spun on either side about what happened. I think that's one way to talk about the question. I think there's another way, though, to talk about the question, which is the way in which 11J as an event kind of intervenes in the broader, longer contestation over the fundamental sort of origin story and persistent story too of the revolutionary state versus its opponents. What I find is, I mean, I think it's no mistake there's no way getting around it from my perspective that, I mean, it's so interesting to think about the ways that social media has, I think, kind of supercharged memory wars of all kinds and made it harder to, in a sense, it's easier to construct. It seems easier to construct one's own truth And so you see in certainly Cuban official media and in those Cubans who tend to support that line, a kind of construction of Once Jota where it was fundamentally about violence, fundamentally about social unrest provoked by, egged on by the United States and Cubans outside the country in such a way that overlooks and delegitimizes completely what may have been the grievances of those who took to the streets and why, right? On the other hand, I sometimes see a little bit of the other narrative that I see circulating, the kind of other polar opposite narrative about Once Jota is that the context of US-Cuban relations, for example, had nothing to do with it, which is not to say I believe that it was at all simply a US concocted plot. I think that's farcical, right? To construct it, just as that. But to ignore the ways in which Cuba's difficult economic situation, and to the extent that US policy, for example, US sanctions are an aggravator for that, perhaps fed into part of the social environment, again, not all of it, but at least part of it, that created this moment of a singular urban unrest. That part of the story sometimes I think is being written out of other memory narratives, right? So I think we will continue to argue over the meaning and the memory of Once Jota, particularly as we approach the 1-year anniversary. It is a before and an after moment, I think, in contemporary Cuban history, certainly. Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, what I can say is that I have seen many Cuban friends for whom, in the same way that I was describing those visits of 1979 as one moment, at least for some Cubans, kind of bringing down the veil, at least and forcing them to kind of question how they understood the Cuban state telling its own story of the history of Cuba or the history of its present. I see many Cubans having that similar kind of moment or reaction in the wake of how the Cuban government has treated those protesters. So I think it's absolutely pertinent to the story. And had my book come out in the spring of 2022 rather than the spring of 2021 before it happened, I certainly would have felt some inclination to write about it in the conclusion.
Thank you. Another question from David Abraham from the School of Law. And I read, whether the Russians in Paris in the 1920s or the US Cold Warriors who tried to figure out who lost China, in quotes, it's no surprise that before a dominant narrative sets in, there will be more open debate across a much broader spectrum. The hard line sets in after significant external events. Any obvious analogs here? I mean, is there an analogy between this and the Cuban case?
Yes and no. I mean, I think what I find is it seems to me that just when you think that, the perennial kind of debate in Cuban memory politics or memory culture, even in the revolutionary camp, is why does the revolution radicalize in the way it did between 1959 and 1961? And just when you think that debate seems to be settled on one side of the Florida Straits or the other, or there is a kind of set narrative that is established, I have found examples of those narratives being questioned and rewritten all over again. Some of that is facilitated too by things happening on the other side, and I'll give an example. Cuban exiles certainly debated, as did U.S. policymakers, right? The who lost Cuba question is, when did Fidel become communist, right? Was the radicalization all along of the revolution the hidden agenda all along? Was it something that was a choice made sort of along the way, et cetera? And so you see Cuban exiles debating that. And you see even some more progressive Cuban exiles by the mid 60s into the 70s, sometimes even arguing that they believe that US policy of early hostility toward the revolution had something to do with kind of pushing the revolution into a more radical direction, which is a narrative that others in exile certainly contest. But then, the Cuban government for a long time, their position was, that the revolution had evolved in power, that it was sort of a constellation of forces. On the one hand, US aggression, the sort of way in which the early, more moderate revolution gives rise to a class war within, that this all sort of spurred a kind of a coming to consciousness of what was a revolution that needed to be socialist in nature, but acknowledging that that was not what revolutionaries said that they were going to do at the beginning. And then by 1975, Fidel Castro, in the lead up to the first Congress of the Cuban Communist Party, says literally, no, in fact, we were all communists all along. And so this is all of a sudden, the folks in Miami who had been on the pro-Batista side and had been arguing that, they have this big sort of "I told you so" kind of moment, right? Because Fidel is now saying exactly what they have been arguing for years, right? And so it just seems to me, I don't know if there's a kind of a steady state for these questions. They seem to just continually circle and roil, certainly across the 1960s and 70s for the period that I studied.
Thank you. There's another question there's two more, but I'll go one. I missed one. So coming from Sam Johnson, another PhD student in modern languages and a UMIA graduate fellow next year. And he says, not wanting to generalize, but what productive junctures and analogies do you envision with the idea of memory wars and parallel political tensions between other diasporic Latin American communities and politics in the US and home countries? It says here, I'm thinking of memory wars as a paradigm of sorts for use in the classroom and teaching of these tensions around kind of transnational politics and memory to students.
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly was motivated in part to do this work because I think in the Latin American scholarship, but certainly the historical scholarship, the theme of memory and conflict over memory, and you can pick your term, memory wars, retrospective politics, this had been really quite a central theme in the literature of contemporary historiography of say the Southern Cone or Central America in the wake of civil wars, right? And it seemed to me that to the extent that those histories of those particular places also have connections to diasporic experiences, whether it's refugees from the Central American civil wars who find themselves in the United States and are part of a solidarity movement with criticizing military rule in those places, right? Or whether it's the history of Chilean exiles in the United States or Paris or Brazilian exiles and them fighting the memory wars for their own communities. I mean, I think that the concept has lots of different application. It certainly has wide application in many contexts outside of Latin America too, certainly inside the United States. There are all kinds of memory wars. I think what's perhaps compelling to me, dare I say unique about the Cuban experience, is just how concentrated the diaspora was. And some of that has to do with geographic proximity, right? But the way in which I think the exile community, while never a unified whole and never having kind of a state of its own, does kind of serve as this sort of counterweight to the Cuban state in terms of trying to sell narratives to the world with a degree of intensity that I wonder if it's easy to find in other analogous cases, right? But I think there are all kinds of memory wars in all kinds of Latin American diaspora communities. One thinks about the sort of roiling up and down patterns of nationalist politics in Puerto Rican communities throughout the United States, and the way new generations of Puerto Ricans are educated in a nationalist historical account of Puerto Rican history that forces them to question the colonial relationship with the United States and therefore engage in debates over status and things like that. Linking, as many Puerto Rican activists did in the 1960s, the colonial condition of the island as they saw it to the colonized condition of Puerto Rican communities, say in places like Spanish Harlem in New York. So, I mean, I think memory wars are everywhere we look. I don't think there's a community or a country that doesn't have them, right? I think there's something particularly central about the memory wars in the Cuban context because, unlike in the Chilean context, or unlike in the Guatemalan context, it's not as if the end of the Civil War, the end of the Pinochet dictatorship represent an end of the memory wars about what those periods represented at all, right? But there is at least some kind of a point of end where the thing that you're fighting over ostensibly has ended, at least in some ways. In the Cuban context, we're not there, or we're not there yet. And so there's a way in which I think the memory wars have become kind of a central axis of the Cuban conflict itself over time, in a way that certainly after the mid-1960s, actual armed conflict, for example, was not, right? So I don't know, I'll have to continue to reflect on that. But I am interested in kind of bringing Cuba into a comparative conversation with the region, and vice versa.
Okay, and one last question from Jorge Ulloa, who's in the Department of Anthropology and Latin American Studies. And he says, in the legitimation of the revolution during their first years, the Cuban government made some changes in the narratives of Cuban history books. The revolutionary narrative also included the formal education in those moments. So I guess, how is it that the revolutionary narratives, has an impact, right, and transforms education?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not something that I felt I could treat centrally. I was interested, certainly, in thinking about, what would it look like to sort of look at the history of textbooks that were assigned. The reality was I didn't have access to the archives of the Ministry of Education in Cuba. Very few people do. One exception to that is the work of my colleague Rainer Schultz, who completed his doctorate at Harvard University a few years ago now. He wrote a wonderful dissertation, which I hope will become a book someday, about the history of the transformation of the Cuban educational system after 1959, and particularly after 1961, when private educational institutions in Cuba are nationalized or confiscated, depending on your point of view. But he does do some of that work of in a fine-grained way, seeing how the narratives of history that are being taught in schools are themselves evolving. I had access to some of that at the most superficial level. One famous example is the ways in which the booklets for the famous Cuban literacy campaign in 1961 are also kind of teaching a very basic proto version of the revolution's history. F is for Fidel, F is for fusil or rifle, et cetera, et cetera. I think part of the mass media products that I engage with in this book are also part of a kind of a popular education. Certainly that comic book of the album of La Revolución Cubana is a ubiquitous kind of source that many people grew up with. And it's interesting because some of the very heroes that it celebrates, within a year after its publication, they have gone into exile, or they're out of good graces with the revolutionary government for one reason or another. So I think, education kind of works its way into the book in that way, but in terms of the actual, materials being taught in schools, absolutely, that'd be a wonderfully kind of complementary source base to engage with for this study. I didn't have access to it. There's a longer conversation about Cuban archival access, but my colleague Rainer Schultz did. So look for his work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael, for the excellent presentation and engagement with the questions. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you will join us next year. From both UMIA and plans that Michael has. We hope to come together and have yet, another year of engaging presentations, not only on Cuba, but Cuba in relation to Latin America, Cuba from transnational perspectives. So thank you very much. And we look forward to you joining us next year. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.